So I just wanted to, or we wanted to basically take some time to just talk a little bit about our journey, because it's not something we really talk too much about. And it's easy to kind of look from the outside, and we get these comments every so often um, talking about how easy we make it look. But it really has been a journey. It's taken us every single one of these years to get to where we are. And I think there's some interesting lessons kind of along the way. So let's get into it. So Michelle and I both started off, I'm just going to stop my share here for a second. We both started off as mechanical engineers in the oil and gas industry. And I actually think traveling around the world was your idea originally. And as a result of our conversations, I ended up getting Jeff Lawton's video in my inbox one of these days, one of the days that I was working, getting ready to take down a massive swath of trees to bring in a new gas pipeline. And after watching Greening the Desert, I remember calling Michelle and saying, you know what, we should do the traveling thing, but let's consciously choose where we're going to go, and let's use those resources to better ourselves, to learn about how to make the planet a better place. Because the narrative in the oil and gas industry was that we were always going to use oil and gas. There's no other alternatives. And the world was just going to kind of continue on that path forever. And in parallel, I was learning about things like peak oil and resource constraints. And so all the things that I was focusing on, that we were focusing on our career, were in my opinion at that time, we're coming to an end. And there's definitely those signs continue to show themselves as we kind of work through this year right now. And so we sold everything we had, a lot of things that we had. We put our money into a couple of interesting investments, namely a 1983 Volkswagen Westphalia van that I carefully chose because see if I can get this to go. It was the only diesel van I could find in Canada, and I thought I was getting a great deal on this thing. I paid $5,000 for this van. We repainted it, and I converted it to run on veg oil. And in fact, that back little box right there was where all of my veg oil pumping equipment was. And so we would.
So for anybody not familiar with running a diesel on veg oil.
Yeah, you can run a diesel engine on vegetable oil. Vegetable oil has a similar energy density to diesel. In fact, who was talking about it yesterday? Man, I haven't had enough coffee this morning. Anyhow, we wanted to basically drive through North America and look for these sustainable solutions in this van. And so we lived in here for 6 months. We spent another 6 months in Denmark at a renewable energy institute called the Folk Center. And everywhere we went, we started to realize that the narratives that we were being told in the oil and gas industry were just one story out of many, many stories. And in fact, there were much more positive and hopeful stories around the planet. And eventually, as a result of all of our travels, we traveled to Denmark and Europe and Mexico and Canada, and the United States, Australia, Africa. We realized that we could probably repower the world, that we could probably overcome peak oil, but how we feed the world, how we deal with our waste issues, that was a far harder, more wicked problem to deal with. And that's where we stumbled upon permaculture. And so here's just a couple of shots from our Mexico trip. We would find these random locations on the side of the road and set up shop basically. And we woofed at a lot of farms. It was such an amazing time. And it's easy to kind of want to jump straight into getting a farm, but having those years, I don't know, do you want to speak to some of those experiences?
Now you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, well, it's your life too. It's all right. They'll come up, they'll bubble up from her as we go through this. But we ended up on farms all over the place and learned kind of what we wanted and what we didn't want. Finally, kind of stopping in at the Bullocks farm on the way home, which is in Seattle or Washington on the West Coast, taking our PDC. And that was kind of the end. Like that was the beginning of the end, essentially. We couldn't go back to the way that we were.
I'll tell a story now. I remember we were leaving our first permaculture design course on Orcas Island that would be on the east coast of the US.
West Coast.
Is the West Coast? Oh yeah, West Coast of US, sorry. And Rob said to me, I'm going to teach permaculture design. And I kind of looked at them because we'd just taken this course. It's like, yeah, this is my life's work. This is what I want to do. And so it's really, I didn't believe him.
Yeah. So when you're committed to something and you kind of you don't necessarily know how you're going to get there, but you should never let your resources limit your vision. And so we had a vision of what we wanted to do, and we came back to Calgary and started working on it. And because we hadn't had jobs for a long time, we looked for every possible way to save money. And so this is a dog that tried to kill us a couple of times. It wasn't our dog. We ended up house sitting for a whole bunch of people, which allowed us to basically cut our rent cost to nothing. In fact, sometimes they even paid us to take care of their animals and take care of their house. And we did this for a long time while we kind of got our feet underneath us. And it gave us the ability to keep our burn rate really low. It gave me the ability to learn more about permaculture. And in fact, Michelle did end up going back to work for a little while I kind of got my career reoriented. And that allowed me to travel to Australia, where I ended up spending 6 months down there, a big portion of that with Jeff Lawton on his farm, training underneath him. And so while we have a farm now, we started from very humble beginnings, and we were laying the foundation at that point to be able to do what we're doing now. And every little step was a step closer.
Yeah, and this is more than 10 years ago, right? I think timeline wise, this is over.
Oh, it's probably 14 years ago now. We've been married, we've been together for 20 years.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
I really like this photo. This was a big part of one of my most favorite photos in the book. And
illustration.
Yeah, illustration. Mm-hmm. And it kind of illustrates that we tend to all have far more resources than we ever account for, because all we ever really look at is the balance sheet in our bank account. But if each one of these ladders represents kind of one of the 8 forms of capital, if you're not actively accounting for all the different capital that you have in your life, community, and social, intellectual, experiential, I mean, there's all these different ways to live in capital, to basically accrue value. And if you just kind of try and stack all of those other things up in the wrong orientation, or you don't understand what you've actually got because you've never taken the time to do a resource inventory, you can always end up feeling like you're dirt poor. But when you start looking at all of the resources, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later in the show, in the talk that we're giving, you start realizing that you're actually a millionaire or a billionaire, because all of these resources are, and sometimes they're even worth more than the money that you have in the bank. And so I often say that for every dollar in the bank that we have thousands of dollars in relationships. And so while we were house sitting, we were actually looking, we didn't know it at the time, but we were looking at our forms of capital in a very different way. And after a while, we decided that we just needed to get on the ground. We needed to actually have a piece of property that we could start practicing on. And this is Michelle's mother's house. You grew up in this house.
This is the house I grew my childhood home.
Yeah. And both of our kids were born in this house, actually. We had home births in here.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we would be where we are right now, speaking of social capital, without the push from your mom.
Well, and I think, when we were trying to decide our next step a decade ago, rather than get our own mortgage and get into debt, we approached my mom about, could we get into a co-living arrangement, and could we work with her? Would she be willing to provide the space and the kind of the land resource in the house? And we were keen to,
and the financial resource,
but we were keen to come up with the do the retrofit and start practicing on this urban lot here in Calgary.
Yeah. And so we often get asked about eco villages and cohabitation and creating these intentional communities. And I usually tell people not even to bother until they've actually had some practice living with their in-laws. because most of us can't live with our parents or our in-laws. It's just kind of part of that Western philosophy. And it's really interesting in this neighborhood. We lived in the east side of Calgary, where there's a lot of ethnicity, and almost every one of our neighbors had multi-generational families living in those houses. And so we were no different than any of them. And it's really easy to kind of idealize the idea of living in community with lots of people on a piece of land. But there's a lot of opportunities, and there's lots of challenges that come with it. And I think
and lots of skills that are needed, really. Right?
Yeah, but lots of resources. I mean, I don't think I would have survived the birth of my two children had my mother-in-law not been there. She's probably spent more nights awake than I did in those first few years when the kids were constantly feeding in the middle of the night. So having multiple generations in your life is really fantastic. And that's not something that I ever had pictured in my the earlier part of my life. And so this house was covered in vinyl siding. It had poor insulation, poor windows, and it was a conventional lawn, a conventional backyard. And you can actually go onto Google Earth and go to the maps view and watch the progression of our property over the years, because Google continued to photograph it. And so when we were looking at this property and what it could offer us, it was 5,000 square feet, or about 500 square meters, really small piece of property. And so we wanted to maximize what we got out of the property. And so permaculture design is quite a complex subject, and it's hard to kind of wrap your head around it. But do you want to talk a little bit about this illustration?
Well, this is another illustration from the book that turned out incredibly well. We're so excited about it. And we're going to talk more about Jarrett at the end of the day, the illustrator. But I think the pinball machine analogy is a really beautiful way to help explain what permaculture designers try and do. And I think permaculture designers in general love playing this like analogy of the pinball machine.
Yeah, and so the goal of the pinball machine is basically that a ball goes into the system, and so we can think of that as phosphorus or nitrogen or water or carbon or labor. And our job as designers is to keep those elements in play as long as possible. And every time a ball drops out of the pinball machine, we lose. And so
through that sink, you know, traditional, or I'd say modern day design, a lot of modern day design, those pinballs are just being allowed to enter and go straight to sink. Nobody's hitting the paddles. Nobody's trying to keep any of those things in play, whether it's water that's, clean treated water coming in from the municipal water system, going to your drinking water, going to your toilet, and one flush, shoom, straight to sink, right?
Yep.
Or if it's the groceries you're bringing in from the grocery store that got them from California, you eat the inside banana and the peel, you put it in the black garbage bag and shoom, straight to sink, going out to the municipal landfill.
Yep.
So modern design is this source to sink on these properties, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we wanted to take this small piece of property, which is basically just a solar collector. That's all every square meter on Earth actually is, and optimize every square meter of it that we possibly could in order to keep as many of the energy flows in cycle for as long as possible. And so after, 10 years, we had completely retrofitted the house, and I'll show you some images of that retrofit. We had increased the R value in the walls by a factor of 3 or 4. We reduced the energy consumption in the house by a factor of 10. We replaced all the windows. We put in light tubes. We had a solar thermal system on the back. The whole front yard went from being lawn to food forest with a fedge. So all of our, all these little cherry hedges, basically on the front were our invitation to the neighborhood to come in and eat some of the abundance coming out of the front yard. We had birds and bugs showing up on our property that had never been seen in this neighborhood, probably not for a very long time. I had girls and school kids, basically. I had one high school girl come by and just randomly sit on this front garden box right here and start crying. And I happened to be in the front yard, and I said, what's wrong? And she said, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in the neighborhood, and I just can't help but sit down and cry. It was a very, very surreal experience. I used to spy out of this window and watch my neighbors stealing the food out of the front yard.
But I wasn't really stealing because we had an open invitation.
Of course.
There's cherries right there.
But they
Yeah.
thought it was stealing. And so they would like secretly come and pick the cherries off of these front bushes. And
Yeah.
it was a really lovely to watch the transformation of this front yard. And so from an aerial view, our front food forest is right here. You can kind of see our solar thermal system and our light tubes, which provide light inside of our house. And our backyard garden, a passive solar greenhouse with a rocket mass heater, rainwater harvesting, an outdoor kitchen with a cob oven inside of it, underground rain storage, an illegal gray water system, which we had to decommission because we got caught by the city. And so lots and lots going on in here. And actually, this is a video here. So this is going to show you what's going on our property. And so the point of showing what you can do on such a small space is that you don't need to have a farm in order to start meeting your supply chain requirements. You can get an awful lot done in a really small space if you use permaculture design and intentionally stack functions onto your property. And so over the years, we had hundreds of people, thousands of people probably come through our property to see what is actually possible. You can kind of see the contrast between, this is what a typical property looks like on this. In fact, some of our neighbors even had plastic lawn versus this food forest right here. Okay, and I'm going to have to. So we did everything wrong at the beginning. Like, we were two engineers from the oil and gas industry. And I remember getting my mother-in-law, convincing her to go and rent a truck with me and bring in, I don't know, what, 15 or 20 yards of horse manure. And I just layered it down like a foot thick. It was just the most ridiculous thing I ever did. And I didn't even know very much about water harvesting to begin with.
Or growing. I'd never grown a plant when we first got started. And
so we covered this lawn with horse manure and cardboard and wood chips. We're like, oh yeah, we're doing permaculture now. And the point is the plants came through. They did what they were supposed to do, and biology kind of stepped in and replaced anything that we didn't know, and because the biology knew what to do. And we were just kind of creating conditions for it to thrive. And some things didn't thrive, but a lot of it did. We sheet mulched the entire backyard. This was Michelle's old trampoline site right here. And it was basically just a gravel pad, and we turned it into the most luscious garden as a result of all of the amendments that we put in. We were in the backyard digging swales, and I mean, we had literally kind of like dinosaur bones coming out of here. It was garbage clay that grew nothing except for weeds. And just by getting water access and structures fixed, we were able to turn this into an incredibly productive little space. And so this is our first garden right here, actually. We overplanted in kale and chard. We have so much food coming out of this garden, and it was all the same stuff. I don't think we ate a fraction of it because I don't think we'd ever really eaten kale before this. And potatoes and squash. And so luckily our first garden was really successful because it really kind of kept us going. Here's some of the retrofit going on in the house that made the house much more livable in the long run. We built a passive solar greenhouse in the backyard. Everybody thinks it's attached to the garage, but it's not. I made tons of mistakes in here. And while we're building much bigger greenhouses now, a lot of the learnings from these big greenhouses have come from this small greenhouse. And in fact, we're going to take this greenhouse off of its foundation. We're going to bring it up to the farm. I'm going to turn it into a wood kiln because it's perfect for kilning wood. We've got a big forest now, and we're going to be kilning all of our lumber on there. Do you want to say anything about the garden?
Just bringing it back a little bit to that pinball machine analogy is, before a drop of rain would land on the roof of or one of the hard surfaces and basically go almost straight to storm sewer, right? It would travel down the roof, hit the gutter, go down into the downpipe, and then probably out into the storm sewer. And probably the water would leave dirtier than when it landed on the roof, right? Because it's picking up stuff from the asphalt roof and what have you. But now, with all these changes we made and all the paddles we put in, a drop of rain falls on the roof, it hits the downspout. It goes through like a leaf diverter, which is a little screen. It goes into a large rainwater tank. We have several all over the property, and we hold back a certain volume of rain so that we have storage. Now we're creating storages on our property. So when we do need the water, it's right there. But of course, on a big rain event, it's going to overflow. And then that overflow still doesn't go to the storm sewer. We redirect that overflow into our garden beds, into, different types of mulched basins and swales and rain gardens, basically. And then what's really neat about that is now by putting that water into the ground, the biology takes hold of it. And we're growing plants, we're increasing soil carbon, it's like you're creating this upward spiral. And then finally, when there's too much water, that the rain tank is full and the rain gardens are full, and that water finally spills out into the storm sewer system, it's cleaner than when it left, right? So, that's just a tangible example of that, those paddles we have in play. And then the added bonus of like the resources leaving our property are better. And I remember hearing Rosemary talk about that yesterday. And so there's a tangible example of how you can do that quite easily on American property.
Yeah. And so food was a yield, rainwater was a yield. 2 little kids grew up out of this garden, and friendships were made. And so Ashley Lubick, a good buddy of mine, helped me build my first rocket mass heater in our greenhouse. And I helped him build a couple of his. And this community of permaculturists started to emerge out of the woodwork as we started to make all the mistakes that we were making on our property. And in fact, one of the things that came out of this as well was the Calgary Permaculture Guild, which Michelle and I both co-founded. And it's still running today. And if you were listening to Jeff Lawton's talk yesterday, they're actually starting to take political action now and starting to try and get laws around chickens amended in the city of Calgary so people can start to grow their own chickens and eggs. And so every possible piece of capital that you could accumulate was being accumulated on this tiny little piece of property in the east side of Calgary. Here's our first cob oven, and we ended up putting on a workshop on how to build cob ovens with Ashley as well. Turned out into a turtle, and thousands of pizzas came out of this oven, and many relationships. We used to have massive parties in our backyard, and people would pick food out of the garden, prepare it in our outdoor kitchen, and I would be the chef, putting the pizzas into the oven and bringing them out. And people were always amazed that we were able to produce pizzas in less than 30 seconds because our oven got so hot. And so this became a really core part of our property because it was our community hub. It was where we gathered and shared meals, and the abundance coming out of our tiny little garden in our backyard. And Michelle went from being a plant killer to the ultimate green thumb. As she's an amazing gardener and all self-taught, all organized. We've got an incredible seedling operation going on right now at our farm. And all this knowledge came out of small and slow solutions, which is one of Holmgren's principles. You start small and you work up.
Yeah. Although the more you know, the more you realize, the more you don't know.
Well, and so humility is a big part of all of this stuff, and that you're humbled by every year. And when you think about it, the average human life, we don't get that many gardens.
Yeah, well, one reason to start, if you've never grown a garden, is okay, I've been gardening for a decade now, but that's still only 10 gardens, right? Like you get one, well, especially in northern climates, you get one shot every year, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the best tips I received early on was to take good records, take good notes as you're going through it. Because if you want to learn and be able to incorporate those learnings a full 12 months later, having good notes, at least with my memory, is really important.
And so we had interns come to our property, and so students would come and learn from us and help us with our gardens. Here's some of our first interns, and they were just such lovely people. They would come rain or shine, in our tiny little garden.
Oh, there's Jordan and Teresa.
Yeah.
Look at those people.
Tyler,
Oh,
and I think Lisa is there too.
yeah, man.
We got a solar thermal rig from a company called Simple Solar, and I'll talk a little bit about them later. They're one of the sponsors for the event. They make the best solar thermal systems. Most of our hot water, like 80 to 90% of our hot water in our house, came from this little simple system. And so we were able to get off of natural gas for taking showers. And so I'll talk a little bit more about how their systems work a bit later. And this was one of the most amazing byproducts that came out of this garden, were these two little rascals.
Garden gnomes.
And Rowan on the right, and Naomi on the left. Power to the carrot. And my goodness, you couldn't have asked for a better place for them to get food out of. And they used to create little hiding spots and forts inside of the food forest in here. And so our little tiny forest became one of their favorite places to go out. And every day they'd go out and they knew all the names of the different plants and the berries. And it was just such a lovely place and accoutrement to our home to have these amazing gardens in the front and the backyard.
Biology, the biophilia, basically, right?
Yeah. It's another photo of our garden from the backyard. And, when you have such a small space, you've got to go vertical. And so Michelle came up with systems to stack her plants and kind of get that vertical edge going. And I mean, everything about our gardens and our food forests were wrong in the sense that, we did not have full sun. Our backyard garden only got 6 hours, and our front yard garden at best got 6 hours. And so we were always kind of dealing with a suboptimal situation, which is what we're so excited about right now with this more space to play with and actually having a full day of sun in our gardens. But those were really important constraints to help us learn about like learning to grow in difficult situations makes you a better grower when you get good conditions. It's easy to get down on yourself with what you don't have. It's much more difficult, but much more productive to kind of be appreciative for what you do have. And so at the end of our project, before we moved out here, we had a 200 square foot passive solar greenhouse. We had an urban clothesline, which in some parts of the city is illegal. We had a shade sail, an outdoor kitchen and cob oven, and a little community gathering space here, an underground water storage tank, solar thermal array, super insulated walls, roof and windows, a passively irrigated food forest. So every drop of rainwater got collected either in the garden, a rain tank, or the front food forest, a fruit hedge. We even convinced our neighbors to let us harvest the rainwater off of their roof for a case of Budweiser beer. And so we were capturing 15,000 liters of water per year in this food forest and 15,000 liters from this food forest. So this roof fed this one and this roof fed this one. And then all the water from the back of our house into these gardens, into the rain tank, all the water off of this outdoor kitchen, and all the water off of this garage and greenhouse. And my gosh, like I can't even imagine how much food we're going to grow this year, because we probably got close to 1/8 of an acre just in garden now, maybe a bit more than that. And through all of it, our community came forward, and this was a sign that we got gifted from one of our students, Warren, and we put this at the front of our property and tried to encourage other people to grow, and our neighbors did.
Mm-hmm.
They started putting in food into their own front yards. And so growing your own food is like printing money. And then this guy came into my life, Dakota, and my vision shifted very rapidly, and I wanted to have a farm, but I didn't know how I was going to get there. And so one of the most important lessons in our book is really clarifying your vision and your values. And we have a whole chapter dedicated to this. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? No? Okay. And I think that, like, even though we had a vision when we started off at Michelle's mom's place, we didn't have it on paper. And so it was good that we were very good communicators, because we were able to have those conversations on a regular basis with regards to what we wanted. But when kids come into your life and businesses start to grow, it gets more challenging to make sure that you're on the same page. And so holistic management came into our life. And then we looked at what we liked about that, and we started to kind of morph it into our own version of our goal statement or our vision statement. And we've talked a little bit about the 8 forms of capital and all the different forms of capital that you accrue all through your life. And we had never really done that in any kind of formal way. And so we actually started to inventory all the different forms of capital, and that included relationships and the money that we had and the material assets that we had and the community assets that we had and the cultural assets and the spiritual assets. All of these different forms of capital formed our holistic balance sheet. And we knew what our values were, because in permaculture, our values are our ethics. So earth care, people care, and future care. And so what you end up doing is the intersection between these 3 things. And a lot of times people working jobs they don't love, or not acknowledging their values, or not actually doing an inventory of their resources, these circles won't intersect. And this is when people get depressed, and they struggle in life, because they can't visualize all of these different facets of their life. And they end up feeling like they're compromising. And so the first part of our permaculture life, we were clear about what our vision was. And while we weren't necessarily living our perfect vision, because we didn't really want to live in a city, when we looked at the resources and the values and all of the opportunities that we had, every time we went out and looked for a rural piece of land, a farm, which we thought was going to be a better representation of our vision, when we looked at the things that we were going to have to compromise, like I'd have to get another job, we'd have to take on a mortgage, I'd get less time with my kids. The job might not be something that I wanted to have, it might not meet my values. Every time we went through a decision framework, and we'll talk about that in a second, the option of staying longer in the city or buying a piece of property, the city option was always better. Even though we wanted to live rurally, we wanted to have a farm, we knew that we were going to have to compromise other things in our life, other parts of our vision, in order to attain this farm. And so that's part of making a good decision, is being able to weigh those different options. And so part of our book was really important for us to be able to help people to clarify their vision and values, help people to quantify their resources, and then provide people with the ability to make good decisions rapidly. So that, because if you make decisions that take your vision and values and resources into account on a regular basis, eventually your vision will just appear right in front of you, because your long-term perfect vision is just the result of thousands and thousands of little tiny decisions that allow you to decide in the right direction. And so we actually took time to get onto the same page. And in our book, we have a whole section dedicated to helping you. This is one of the big value pieces in the book. And everybody wants to talk about cob ovens and rocket mass heaters and gardens and swales and rain gardens and solar photovoltaic systems and all the different sexy things that exist on a permaculture property. But if you don't have a clear sense of where you're going, you will end up where you're going, which is nowhere. What's the famous quote from, is it Seneca? If one does
not know
to which
port one is sailing,
then no port is favorable, or then no wind is favorable.
Yeah.
If one does not know if one does not know which port one is sailing to, then no wind is favorable. And so it's a sailing analogy, and wind goes in circles on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're saying yes to every single wind, and you're constantly changing your tack, then you just end up going in circles as well. So you have to know what to say yes to and what to say no to. And so this is our guiding compass. This is our heading. Our decision-making framework is our compass. This is the heading that we're heading towards. And so in here, we've got statements about each of the forms of capital, which is what we're accruing as we go through life. So financial, social, material, living, intellectual, experiential, spiritual, and cultural. And you can read up all on this in our book, or if you Google the 8 forms of capital, in terms of what each of these forms of capital actually represent. And so our vision is to live in a way that is good for myself and all of my relations, and allow all others the same opportunity or better into the future. And I'm not going to go through each of these things because we're running out of time right now. But every time a decision gets made, when we make a decision, we make sure that we're not compromising any of these forms of capital. In fact, that our decisions are actually reinforcing them, or sometimes we're shifting one form of capital into another. So it's not uncommon for us to, for example, spend money and reinforce material capital or living capital or intellectual capital. So from the oil and gas industry, we took money that we had achieved as a result of working in the oil and gas industry, and we moved a ton of it into intellectual capital by traveling the world and learning things, and experiential capital by getting experience, essentially. You want to add anything to that?
No, and this is a sample. This is a sample holistic. This is a sample vision and values one pager. And yes, it is in the book, and we're not going to have time to go through it in detail. But this is really, I'll just emphasize that one big shift for us was not focusing on the what.
It's the why.
And even though we kind of knew we wanted a farm, we got really clear on the why. What were we trying to achieve with that what?
Yeah.
And by making day-to-day decisions, using that focus on what was important to us, and fundamentally the kind of quality of life we wanted to live and our own well-being, I think that really helped us. It was monumental, really.
Yeah.
One of the things we did right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the why is actually more important than the what. We're not killing ourselves building a farm right now because, we want to build a farm. We want to build a farm because the farm is a beautiful expression of providing us with the kind of quality of life that we actually want for our kids and for ourselves. Nutrient dense food, a natural place to live, wildlife to be able to observe, clean air, clean water, all of those things that are really important to us, and a thriving community of people that are achieving similar objectives. Okay, and so again, just to show this, it's like what do you want, what do you have, and what is right, and that gives you information on what to do. And so this kind of solves one of the big problems in permaculture, is that people come out of a PDC and they've got all these great ideas on all the things they want to implement.
I want to do.
Yep.
I want to do, right?
Yep. But they haven't got clear on why they want to do it, or what doing that thing is going to actually give to them.
Or if there's a better way or a better thing that'll give them that well-being faster, or propel them towards their vision more effectively or more efficiently.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of people buy the wrong piece of land, is that they just go out and buy a piece of land without clarifying their vision, only to get there to realize that that piece of property is not right for them. So then you either have to change your vision or you have to change your piece of property. And so we actually do this with our clients. It's one of the first things that we do every time we get together with a client, is make sure that they're clear on their vision. And in fact, a lot of times we say that we're marriage counselors, because we end up in these conversations with husband and wife, helping them to articulate what their individual visions are, and trying to find the intersection between those two people that are going to be managing this piece of property in order to propel their well-being. And again, so once you know what you have and what you want, and what your values are, you can start to place your ladders in the right orientation in order to get to your well-being as fast as you possibly can. And so this is also included in the book. This is the Good Decision Worksheet. And this is basically a flow chart that helps you get through all these little thousands of little tiny decisions that you have to make, ensuring that you're going to make good decisions. And if you make enough good decisions, eventually your vision will come through. And so I think we're running out of time here, but really quickly, the first thing, and I think one of the most important things, is you record the decision that you're trying to make. It's very common when there's two or more managers, for one or more people to not be on the same page in terms of what you're deciding toward. And so one person can think one thing and another person thinks something else. And so actually taking the time to properly articulate a decision is really important. Then you review the decision in terms of your vision one pager, values and vision one pager. You test it to make sure that making decisions is not going to ruin you. And I'm not going to have time to go into the details of ruin versus risk, but ruin is basically the end, like bankruptcy or emotional bankruptcy, failed relationships.
Yeah.
And so we want to avoid decisions that have the chance of creating ruin. Everything in life is risk. There's risk involved, and risk is fine. We want to avoid the ruinous decisions. If we're trying to solve a problem, like let's say there's pests on your property, or maybe you don't have enough financial resources, we want to make sure we're not making decisions that deal with symptoms. We want to get to the root cause of the problem. And I should say that when you make a decision through this good decision worksheet, it's very often that you won't necessarily answer a question in each of these different categories. Some of them you end up skipping. They won't be applicable. And so that's why you can get through really difficult decisions within 15 minutes or less when you go through this, because you're not necessarily answering questions for each one. Did you want to add anything to this?
Nope.
Okay. Risk reward ratio. So sometimes like, is it worth investing the time, energy, or resources for what you're going to get out of it? Reflect or repeat. So what does your gut tell you? And so sometimes the decision sheet will say you shouldn't do this, but your gut is saying, no, I absolutely have to do this. And you can't explain rationally why, but gut decisions can be a very valuable reflection. And sometimes you just need to do what your gut tells you to do. And then there's
Write it down.
Write it down. And then randomness. And so this kind of, the randomness piece kind of captures what the Stoics knew. They when you had two really good options, so you're making a decision between option A or option B, and both of them look as though they're going to propel you towards your vision equally quickly, and they're both really, really good options, they would flip a coin. And there's lots written on this, and it sounds crazy that you would get to this point to flip a coin, but if you read any of Nassim Taleb's work, he goes in detail on why the Stoics used a muse or used some sort of a randomness metric in order to try and help them to make a decision between two good options. And so we've had an enormous amount of success using this process. I should just mention the other thing about making good decisions is assuming you're wrong. And so actually premeditating, like, how are you going to know if this decision is actually your choice to run this course is actually wrong? And so you premeditate all the things that you're going to look for in order to determine whether you've actually made a bad decision. And then also counter to that, how do you know if your decision is going to be right?
Yeah. And I'll point out there's a lot of R's, and that's because Dakota loves alliterations.
And to his credit, alliterations are easier to remember. Yeah. So after 10 years of making tons of decisions, we ended up with a quarter section. I don't know how we did it, but it came to fruition. And we're just starting to contour our garden here. And we haven't taken the trees down in our yard, but there's going to be a Pasisler greenhouse here in the next shot. And this is the perfect expression of our vision. It took a long time to get there, but I'm glad we didn't pull the trigger any quicker than this, because we had lots to learn in the city. We had kids to raise, and I mean, not having any debt allowed me to spend way more time with my kids than I otherwise would have in those early years. And so everything happened just as it needed to. And so now we're in the process of constructing this farm. And so we're heavily invested right now in zone 1 and 2. And we will be for many years to come. There's so much to do in just this tiny little zone. And once we have this kind of perfected, then we'll start moving out into our outer zones. And so this was last fall. This is our new Pasisler greenhouse. We've got a much larger garden, as you can see out here. And so this is an 800 square foot Pasisler greenhouse, which is essential to growing in our climate. We have hail here. We can only drink beer outside 2 nights of the year without sweaters. And so it gets cold at night. So this is going to allow us to grow all the root vegetables that we want out here and all of our hot season crops in here. There's going to be a Pasisler greenhouse on the south side of our building. We're going to have solar thermal up on the roof. We've got 2 wood stoves. We've got a cook stove right now we just installed. which is going to provide all of our hot water as well as a lot of our space heat and our cooking. In the background, we've got a solar photovoltaic array, which is providing us with a lot of our electricity. And slowly we're starting to pick things off, and we're using Google Earth Pro as our primary canvas in order to make a lot of these design decisions. And Dakota's presentation yesterday talked a lot about that. And so our book also talks a lot about how to use Google Earth Pro for your own design. And if you get the bundle, we include a little course on how to use Google Earth Pro for your own permaculture property design, so that you can start to make some of these decisions in your own canvas. So just to kind of capture this all, we've got 5 steps in our process. And today we mostly talked about step 1 and how important that has been in moving from a great vision to an even better vision as a result of thousands of decisions. And right now we're kind of at the beginning of our design process. Again, we're just diagnosing our property for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We're starting our design process. We're well along the way, but it never really ends. And we're also kind of in the middle of implementation right now, especially in our inner zones, and monitoring for successes and failures and well-being.
I want to say, what's right for us. I mean, it's fun to share our case story, our case study, and tell you guys, the things that we did and the prescription, the steps we took to get to where we are. But of course, there's so many reasons that you can't copy what we've done. It might not be right for you. You don't have the same resources as we do. You don't have the same vision and values as we do. You don't have the same, everything's going to be different for you than for us. So our best hope with this book wasn't to say, here's what we did, go out and do the same, but rather to share the tools and the thinking that we felt was instrumental in helping us achieve what we've achieved. And our, so really for us, it came back to really getting clear on our vision, making good day-to-day decisions, being really effective with our workflow tools, planning and scheduling, and really there's a big emphasis on all those things in this book. It's about the tools that we use.
And ultimately, it's about your well-being.
Oh yeah, really, it comes down to living the life you want to live,
and
sure.
So,
which isn't the same as ours either, no. Right?
So what makes you happy? What gets you up in the morning? What puts these kind of smiles? Like, man, you almost never see a smile like that on my face when I'm on YouTube. It's not that I'm not happy inside. It's just, but a buddy of mine took a photo of us on the Boron Lakes a little while ago. Jim Little, his website, Mitchell put it up into the chat there, Drawing Borderless. And for me, like, all of the stuff that we do is to achieve this. That's the why. And this why is going to change throughout your life. We might end up on a sailboat sometime in our future, or in a different scenario, and that's okay, because as you grow, you change, you evolve. Life is an adaptive process, but you have to remember that the reason that you do what you do, or the reason you do what you are doing, should be to achieve well-being.
Not only for you, but for our well-being is intrinsically linked to the well-being, really, of all, right? And that's when you really look at it, that epiphany is quite obvious as well, right?